Right, are we good, Wendy?
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to start the recording on this?
Yep, recording.
Okay, awesome.
I'm gonna get started then.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm gonna give also gonna give like 2 more minutes because I know there's a line in the bathroom.
Got it.
But,
Okay.
But let me start the introduction first.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. All right. Thanks for everyone to be here today with us. And so this is our tradition. Have you ever been to our events before? If you have not, can I get a show of hands if this is the first time you've been to our events? Cool. Welcome. So you see our website there. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can follow our WeChat official account. There's a lot of ways to get connected and get notifications for our next series. So please be sure to do that. Okay, before we start, I'm gonna introduce our organization briefly. So we are Bay Area Chinese Culture Salon, BACCS. We strive to be the leading public forum for interdisciplinary knowledge sharing and impartial discussion of public social issues in the North America Mandarin-speaking communities. So after this event today, we will have another upcoming event next Saturday, same place, about same time here. We've invited Xiaolong Huang, who's from San Diego, and he's an engineer, but also an author to his book called Journey to the Heartland. It's an autobiography. And while the bearer of the book story is on LGBT life, the book is largely about immigration, humanity, coexistence of cultures, some debates on liberal political ideas. And Xiaolong will have the conversation with Michelle, who is our co-host of the next event, who is the founder of the Society of the Heart Delight. We are also co-hosting that next event with Chinese Rainbow Network. So please tune in and follow our website for the upcoming news. All right. And if you are interested in support us, you can scan the PayPal QR code, or you can volunteer with us. Please come to talk to any of us volunteers here on site if you're interested in that. And some information about today's event. Please familiarize yourself with the exit and where the bathroom is. We will have a bathroom break during the talk because the bathroom, as you know, is badge accessed. We will be recording today's talk and we will upload it later to YouTube channel. All right, so without further ado, Homeless in the Bay Area by Agnes Cho, and I'm gonna introduce her. So Agnes is an advocate and researcher for housing justice and homelessness. She works at the intersection of policy and community advocacy in housing and homelessness space. And she currently works with Just Cities Institute to expand housing access to people who are formerly incarcerated. She also has researched housing and homelessness programs for the Tanner Center for Housing Innovation and served as a tenant counselor with the tenants together, supporting tenants facing eviction, rent increases, and landlord harassment. She is a master in a public policy student at UC Berkeley Goldman School and has a BA in anthropology from Princeton University. All right, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. Yes, this is my first time doing this. I'm a little nervous. But like Wendy said, my name is Agnes. I am a master's in public policy student at UC Berkeley, and I'm a lifelong California resident. I was born in Brazil. I'm Korean American, but I really grew up in Los Angeles. My parents worked in the garment district in downtown LA, which is right next to Skid Row. So going to work with them, I would always see people who are living on the streets, and this problem just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It no longer was contained to Skid Row, but I'm seeing it more in West LA, in downtown LA, in every single neighborhood. And then I moved up to the Bay Area in 2018 to work in research and evaluation with nonprofits as a researcher, and I'm realizing that it's everywhere in the Bay Area as well. I go to Sacramento, I go to San Diego, I go anywhere in California, and we have a human crisis of homelessness. So I got really, really curious about kind of why is this happening. And while I was in Los Angeles, I had an issue with my landlord where I experienced an eviction myself. My landlord tried to kick us out even though we hadn't done anything wrong. And this just had me thinking, I have this great support system of my family, of my friends, of my partner. I have a job, but if I made a little less, if my rent was more expensive, if I had no savings, I too could end up homeless. So when I moved up to Berkeley, this was in January 2018, I got in touch with people who I know were active in the housing space, and I worked as a tenant counselor. I volunteer work for 4 years with tenants together. They are a nonprofit based in San Francisco, but they run a hotline for renters who are going through evictions, rent increases, landlord harassment, and who are kind of one step away from ending up on the streets or in a shelter or just couch surfing or just housing unstable themselves through no fault of their own. I was really curious about this, and I decided this is what my passion is. I firmly believe that housing is not a commodity. It's not something that we should be trying to make as much money off of. Housing is a human right. And this is what led me to public policy school at UC Berkeley, where I've been studying housing policy and how housing policies intersect with homelessness and this crisis that we're seeing. And I've worked in a research capacity, I'm working in an advocacy capacity. I'm going to try my best to kind of share what I know, but I'm by no means an expert. I'm just someone who's really passionate and have been studying this, so I might not be able to answer all of your questions, but I'm going to try and do your best. Like Wendy said, I'm going to go through as much as I can and say like 45 minutes. We'll pause, we'll have a bathroom break, and we'll come back together. And yeah, again, if you have questions that come up at the end of each section, I'll kind of stop and ask for questions, because maybe some of your questions will be answered in my presentation. All right. So homelessness takes many, many shapes and forms in California. But the fact is that what I want to share with you today is that homelessness is fundamentally an economic problem, not a personal failing. There are 1 in 8 Americans live in California, but California is home to 1 in 4 people experiencing homelessness. Last year, we had 160,000 people on any given night on the street or in a shelter and experiencing homelessness. The biggest concentration is in Los Angeles, but we see it all over in the Bay Area as well. I want to play a clip for you. This is a really, really great clip episode by John Oliver. If you just Google John Oliver homelessness, this is probably going to show up. But I want to just play a short clip just so you can hear the story of someone who ended up housed and losing their home and becoming the statistic of just 1 in 160,000 people.
their income on rent, and only 37 affordable and above. This woman found out.
2 years ago, Priscilla had a full-time job at a health clinic for the homeless. Her husband, Ryan, stayed home to care for their 2 sons. The youngest has severe autism. They lived on a tight budget, and then their landlord raised the rent $150.
That's a lot of money for a lot of people that live paycheck by paycheck, and we live like that.
The family was evicted, and in a place they never imagined, homeless themselves, living in their car.
I work at a homeless clinic and I'm homeless. How the heck does that happen to me?
Yeah, that is an awful situation to be in.
I really recommend the rest of this episode if you're curious and want to learn more. He does it in a way that's much funnier and just much more succinct than I usually do. So really what we're going to talk about today, it's going to be divided into kind of 3 sections. The first is understanding why do we have such a crisis of homelessness in California in the first place? What are the root causes? It's fundamentally a supply issue. We don't have enough housing and we don't have enough affordable housing, and it's also an access issue. The people who need housing are not able to pay for it and afford it. The second thing is the second part will be what are the impacts of the supply and access issue on housing and homelessness? What are the human impacts? Then what I want to share is what are some of the policy responses and solutions California is doing a lot to address the housing and homelessness crisis. However, because of these root causes, the crisis just keeps growing, even though we're putting so much money and so much effort into this. So I'll walk you through these 3 sections, and at the end of each of these sections, I pause and ask for questions. So to start off, the root cause of why is there such a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis? In the Bay Area, since 2011, we've created more than 530,000 new jobs. However, we've only built 125,000 more housing units. Researchers, policymakers, economists say that if you're going to be creating new jobs, you need 1.25 new jobs for every 1 unit of housing, but yet the stat in the Greater Bay Area is 4.3 new jobs for every one new unit of housing. In the San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward area, it's 3.5. In the San Jose, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara area, where we are right now, it's 3.2. What this ends up meaning is that as more jobs are created, especially in such an economically vibrant place like the Bay Area, we've seen that average incomes are growing larger and larger. However, because we're not building enough housing, we are seeing housing prices get higher and higher. It's a simple supply demand. I'm not even an econ major, guys, but this is like econ 101. There's not enough supply, rising demand. The people who have high enough incomes, the people who work at Google, who work at Facebook, can absorb this. They can pay the higher rents, they can pay the higher home prices. However, it's the people who have the lower incomes, who are service staff, who are teachers, who are nursing assistants, who are really the most vulnerable people doing very important work in our society who aren't able to afford these housing costs. So what that means is that they end up spending more of their income on housing, and they end up with a little bit of an income shock. That means that they are really vulnerable to losing that housing. The reason why we have such, part of the reason why we haven't been able to, supply of housing hasn't been able to keep up with this growth in population and this growth in jobs, it's because it's getting more and more expensive to build housing. You might know a little bit about this working in architecture or development. Over the last 10 years, actually the stat is on the next page, it's just getting it's getting more and more unaffordable to build. And the rising cost of housing is fueled by multiple factors, which I'll be explaining in a couple minutes. But what I want to share, I'm sorry, I'm only changing it on my computer. I didn't change it here. I'm sorry about that, guys. So that was the last slide where we have more jobs than housing. And then this is the chart that I want to explain. LIHTC is a low-income housing tax credit. It's the primary way that our federal government and our state government funds the building of affordable housing. So this is kind of the chart of how that shows that the cost of building new affordable housing is going up and up. In 2019, I think the average cost of creating a new LIHTC development in California exceeded $500,000. So for one new apartment, it costs over $500,000 to build. Acquisition and rehab is taking affordable housing units that exist that might have been built 60, 70 years ago and rehabilitating that to make it kind of, because there's wear and tear, buildings get old. That has also been going up. Why is that the case? There are so many different factors that drive the cost of housing development. So in California in the last decade, the per square foot of new housing development has gone up by 25% since 2011. There are many, many reasons. Land is getting more expensive. Materials are getting really expensive. Like my dad was trying to build a new deck during the pandemic and he's like, I can't do this. The cost of lumber is way too expensive. A lot of housing is made of wood. As the hard costs of housing go up, the cost of development is going to go up. Also, the cost of labor is getting more expensive, and right now we're seeing interest rates rise, so the cost of capital is going to be more expensive. There are all these market factors that make it more difficult and more expensive to build. However, there are also policy cost drivers. Some of this include just, it takes a really long time to get permits, and there are a lot of regulations and kind of local control reasons that I'm going to be getting more into for that make it more difficult for, if a developer wants to say, I want to build this new housing. In San Francisco, for example, I think the average amount of time to get approval for a new development was over 2 years. So that means that a developer needs to buy that land and just sit on it as, that's just like time is money. So it gets so expensive. In addition to that, part of the reason that it gets so expensive is because you have local opposition. Guys might have heard of Not in My Backyard or NIMBYs, people who don't want to see more development. We're going to explore this a little bit more, but I just want to put this out there as a factor for why housing costs are going up. There are also parking requirements. I was talking to a planning friend of mine who works in housing development. He said, well, yeah, in California, in the US, we've really created our urban infrastructure where it's really dependent and centered around cars. But that means that people need cars, and you may need somewhere to park their cars. The cost of one parking permit, building one parking spot, ranges between $30,000 to over $100,000 per unit, depending on where you put it. So that's another kind of added cost. There's also, in a lot of contracts that the state might, or that the local government might go into to build new housing, you have something called prevailing wage, where you have to pay kind of union wages. But they've seen that kind of prevailing wage, this is like the construction and labor lobby and workers, that raises total development costs by about $53,000 per unit when you have to pay these higher wages. There's a lot of ADA requirements, the American Disability Act, where say you need an elevator. So putting in an elevator increases costs by about $35,000 per unit. So all of this adds up. In addition to this, affordable housing, that policy landscape is really, really confusing. I'm spending 2 years trying to do a deep dive in this. I'm spending all my time like working in this space for the last 4 years, and I barely am scratching the surface. The funding is really fragmented. On average, in order to fund an affordable housing development, you have to scrape like 3 to 4 different sources of funding, federal, state, local funding, and each new additional source of funding raises costs by about $6,400 per unit, just because of all of the application costs and the administrative costs and the filing costs, etc. So what this means is that as just building gets more expensive, that means that, say, a new unit costs $800,000 to build. That means that the rent that a developer has to charge per household, it comes out to about $4,000. This is why most of the market rate development ends up being luxury development, where you have to have really high incomes to afford. I want to address this topic about kind of NIMBYism and like homeowners. We have created in America a system in which, for the average American household, your wealth is your home. All your savings goes toward your house. And this is, at least when I'm just thinking about my parents, their retirement is going to be, it's their home value. This is what they're going to cash out of. But what this means is that homeowners then are incentivized to keep their property values going up. And therefore, anything that might harm their property values ends up being something that they want to oppose. So I've been to so many city council meetings in Berkeley and in Oakland and in Alameda County where you have homeowners go in there and say, oh no, this development will change the neighborhood's character. I moved here because like this is the kind of place I want to live in, or it'll increase traffic, or it'll be harder for me to find parking. All of that might be inconvenient for that homeowner, might lead to, that might impact the value, the perceived, they might perceive this to impact their fundamental property value. But what this means is that less and less housing is getting built, and which contributes to higher housing costs and rising rents. The other unique thing about California is that the way that our political and planning systems are structured, local jurisdictions have a ton of power over what gets built. Oh, thank you. Over what gets built, thank you. The politics of building new housing is a mess. There are homeowners who'd be like, no, we don't want this to be built. There might be renters who fear that if there's going to be new luxury development coming in, that their rents are gonna go up, and they're afraid. Zoning regulations means that a developer wants to build a 12-story unit in order for their project to pencil, or for it to be financially worth it. However, local zoning might say, no, you can only build up to 3 or 4 stories or 5 stories. So like I mentioned, there have been multiple studies about kind of local opposition and how that slows down new construction and makes it more expensive. Like I mentioned, there was a study by, this 2022 study by the California Air Resources Board that found that it took more than 2 years for a new residential construction in San Francisco to get approved. 2 years. In 2018, there was a study by the Turner Center, which is where I've been working as a researcher. They are a leading housing research lab in California. They found that these permits take longer to pass take longer to be approved in outlying neighborhoods of San Francisco where you see wealthier homeowners, because there is going to be more resistance. They are much more politically engaged. They show up to the city council meetings. They have more time to call their representative, to ask for meetings, etc., versus someone who's working 2 jobs and really is just trying to survive. What this also means, if there's less housing being built in kind of wealthier neighborhoods, it also means that that opportunity that wealthy neighborhood provides, good schools, safe neighborhoods, parks, clean air, all of that becomes hoarded by the people who are currently living there. It doesn't get shared with other families and other people to kind of share in that opportunity. There's recent legislation, which I'll get into in the policy part of this presentation, that's really seeking to change this balance of power between local and state control. SB 35 is one, and is starting a research project on that. So what does this mean? It means that California has just failed to build anywhere close to the number of affordable housing units that the state needs. Every 8 years, the state does an economic analysis process called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. They determine, based on your population, based on job growth, based on income, how many units of housing that each city or jurisdiction needs to build in order to keep up with that demand for housing. You'll see, and then they also look at it based on income. AMI is area median income, looking at the median income in that neighborhood. You're considered extremely low income if you're making 30% of the median income in that region. Low income if you're making 50%. And they, based on your income levels, they say you need to build X number of housing that these people can afford of these varied income levels. No city in California has come close to meeting those targets. They've mostly met their their market rate unit targets, but in terms of affordable targets, for all of these reasons I explained, it's really, really hard to build, and we just haven't come close. Let me pause here. Any questions so far?
I think, what I always wondered was that for places like Singapore and Hong Kong, where things are even more expensive, the government were able to build more affordable housing units, and they're also market economy, so not like planned economy or something. So why is the case that it's so hard for California to build affordable housing units?
We have really strong property rights in America. I'm not really familiar with Hong Kong or Singapore, but I took this one law class that was looking at kind of how property is protected in our federal, in our federal constitution, and that makes it really, really difficult for governments to be able to say, look, here's a single family home or just a plot of land and we want to build here. You can, the people who currently own that property can really make it difficult to build. There are also other things like the California Environmental Quality Act, which is CEQA. Basically in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had a lot of say petroleum companies or heavy industries build their industry in neighborhoods that tended to be lower income and tended to have Black and brown residents. There are huge environmental consequences. Zoning is important. You can't have a gas station next to an elementary school. You can't have a petroleum, you can't have a fracking facility right next to a home. You need zoning to strategically and think about land use. However, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, was passed in the 70s, requiring if a new development is built, requiring governments to study the environmental impact of this. I've seen a CEQA, the CEQA requires an environmental impact review. An average environmental impact review is about 1,000 pages and it's that thick. And it just ends up taking so much time and money, and it just slows the project down. So it just ends up becoming, again, adding to time, adding to costs to make it more and more expensive to build. So I would say, even though we're a market economy and you think that housing, if you think about housing as a commodity, which I would really argue that it is not on both the supply side, but also in the housing as a human rights side. It's just there are all these other policies in place that stymie that our ability to address the supply issue. I hope that answered it a little bit. Okay, I'll take maybe 2 more questions and then I'll move on to the next section and then we'll take a break. Or why don't I hear kind of all your questions and then maybe I can, yeah, sure.
Okay, I've been an architect working on residential projects
in
San Francisco for 4 years. And so I'm familiar with all those issues you mentioned, also the ADA issues, parking issues, and the terrible zoning thing, planning thing, and all the process. I can see the process become more and more complicated and longer since 4 years ago. So I also heard about some program like state density bonus from state level, try to solve this kind of problems. But I'm not sure if you can explain more about that because it's some more political issue between all these things. And the other question is about those ADA and parking issues you mentioned. From the perspective of users, it does help all those residents, but it also adds more cost to the construction fee. So I don't know if you have any point of view on that. Yeah, thank you.
Can I just hear the other questions and then maybe I'll try and address it?
Sure, thank you so much. So I come from San Diego region where I spent 2.5 years doing my master's degree there. So according to the last slide you showed here, it seems like that there's a much bigger gap between the actual demand and the actual units that have been built in San Diego region or county than the gap is in San Francisco. But from my life experience, I can tell that actually the homelessness problem is much more severe here in Bay Area than it is in San Diego region. So I'm not sure what's the root cause of this. And that's my question. Thank you.
Pin that question. I'm going to get to it later on in my presentation.
Sure.
Okay, and then did you also have a question?
Actually, my question is pretty similar to her. So, okay, sure. So I'm just wondering why, what stopped the government have more policy to tax reduction or more bonus to encourage the developer to build more affordable housing? Because recently one of our clients just gave up on the site. They want to build affordable housing there, but eventually they found out they are not going to make any profit. So yeah, that's the question.
These are all such good questions, and we should talk. I would follow the Turner Center if you guys haven't already. They do a lot of great research on kind of housing supply and why development is getting so expensive. To respond to your question I'm going to get to, so don't worry. To respond to your question very briefly is around ADA, parking, all of these things that does like that. Sorry, my dog just got here. Hi, Kobe. I think it's a negotiation, right? I don't think there's one right answer. I think there are some places where you do need ADA, especially if it's like a senior facility where people have mobility issues. But like, does every building need an elevator? Or like, it's just, you know, it definitely is a negotiation. I think this is also where we get into the topic of transit-oriented development, of making sure we can build more housing in areas that are closer to public transit so that will reduce people's dependence on cars. But I think it ultimately goes to a larger conversation of you can't just build housing in isolation. You need to be really strategic about where you build it and what types of housing you build it, etc. To your question around policies that the state can do and like more funding for it, I heard you, we're gonna get to it. All right, that's nice. Yeah. I'm gonna go over this other kind of area of root causes, and then we're just gonna take a quick break, and then for bathroom bio break, and then we'll come back. So fundamentally, kind of what I want to show to you is that homelessness is a housing affordability crisis. In the US, in California, in the Bay Area, rents have been going up much higher than median wages. In California, there are 17 million people who are 44% of the state's residents who rent their homes. People of color and low-income people are more likely to be renters. But we've seen in kind of more expensive coastal areas like the Bay Area, LA, New York, more and more higher income people are being renters as well, just because the price of home ownership is just so high. Rents have been going up much faster than wages, so that means that more people have to spend more of their income on and more of their paycheck on rent. What this means is that more people are cost burdened. So the way that the policymakers think about this is that you're considered cost burdened if you spend more than a third of your income on housing. You're considered extremely cost burdened if you spend more than half of your income on housing. I think of people who are very low income, so that 30% area median income, which by the way, in the Santa Clara County is $44,000 a year, which like as a grad student, I'm considered extremely low income. Over 85% of people in California who are extremely low income are severely cost burdened. Like rent is too damn high, especially for poor people. Over the past decade, in addition to just rents being unaffordable, is that the government, the state, both at a federal level and at a local level, but really at a federal level, just hasn't been supporting renters. Policymakers have failed to create a strong safety net that supports the most vulnerable people who are most vulnerable to experiencing homelessness and falling into homelessness. We've just seen straight up funding cuts to housing programs since Reagan. So this includes like disability benefits, this includes housing vouchers. And there's so much research, like we know this, that if you provide rental assistance, we will reduce homelessness and housing instability. And then there's also all of the follow-on impacts of that, like the impacts on children's health, mental health, like trauma from being homeless. There are I think 1 in 10 Berkeley high school students have experienced homelessness at one point. This is such a fundamental issue that so many people going through, and just the federal assistance that we are getting is nowhere near enough. Of the people who are income eligible to receive rental assistance, only 1 in 4 do. I really love this because it also just shows how long people have to wait. And this is, I think this is a national average, but I just want to share an illustrative example in Berkeley. The Berkeley wait list to even be considered for a housing voucher has been closed since 2012, since Obama was president. Like that means that if your income, if you could not make rent and you were like, and you could not find a job that was going to be paying enough for you to make market rate rent, there was like, Berkeley said, or the housing authority in Berkeley said, I'm sorry, we can't help you. They opened it up for 6 weeks. They opened up 2,000 spots just to join the wait list. Because it's a lottery once you're on the wait list. They opened it up for 6 weeks. They had 2,000 spots. It filled up in under a week. It just shows the extent to which there is demand for this and there just isn't enough supply of rental assistance. There's also a huge mismatch between the assistance that homeowners receive, who tend to be higher income, versus the assistance that renters receive. So the nation's housing policy in America has really been focused on getting people to buy homes. And I'm going to share a little bit more about kind of the history of how this has led to like more segregation and growing inequalities in our wealth gap between kind of white Americans and Black and brown Americans. More than 75% of the federal housing expenditures, kind of if you look at direct spending, tax credits, and subsidies, goes toward supporting home ownership. The way that looks like is the mortgage interest tax deduction. There are other like tax credits you can get if you're a homeowner. The federal housing assistance that benefit families with very little assistance, the federal housing expenditures that don't benefit people who really need this assistance. Most of it, more than half of federal spending, goes toward households that are making more than $100,000 a year. There's also discrimination in the rental market that excludes renters who are the most vulnerable from finding safe, dignified, and affordable housing. So kind of in my introduction, oh, thank you. I really appreciate you. Wendy mentioned that I'm currently working, I worked in kind of eviction protections, and I'm working with people who are formerly incarcerated around their housing. One thing that I've heard from landlords, is like, hey, if someone's been evicted before, then they're at higher risk of being evicted, so I don't want to rent to them. Or, hey, like I need to make sure if I manage this property that like my tenants are safe, and I'm afraid that if I rent to someone who has a felony or a misdemeanor, that I'm not going to be able to keep them safe, so I'm going to do a criminal background check. Or, hey, I need to do a credit check to make sure that people like have good credit. So, because this is an investment, I need to rent to people who are like lower risk financially. All of these might make sense on an individual perspective, though the issue is that the systemic outcomes of this just end up deepening the housing kind of accessibility, and really the people who have an eviction or who have a criminal record, the people are further excluded from the rental market. So let me just speak for a little bit about eviction. So there are many people who've studied eviction or who have gone through an eviction themselves who say that once you've had an eviction, it is a scarlet E that really prevents you from finding housing anywhere. Once you have a formal eviction, it's called an unlawful detainer. It's like a court-ordered eviction. That goes on to private companies kind of scrape your court records, and then they sell that in terms of like a screening check for landlords that they buy into. And they do no due diligence to see if that eviction was your fault, if you were innocent. And it basically blacklists you as a tenant. So people who have been evicted, there's a researcher named Matthew Desmond out of Princeton who wrote this incredible book called Evicted, and he says, poverty doesn't cause eviction, eviction causes poverty, because it just means that it is so much more difficult for you to find a place to live. The other thing about evictions is that it's not a valid indication of whether someone's going to be a good tenant or not. Many tenants lose by default, so a landlord might go in and just file an eviction on you, and the eviction process is extremely difficult and challenging and confusing to navigate. So many tenants in California before, you had 5 calendar days to just even respond to an eviction, even though it was pardon my French, a bullshit eviction notice, and it was no like fault of your own. You had 5 business days. So when I was working at the hotline, we would see a lot of evictions being filed on Thursdays because they knew that the court was closed on Saturday and Sunday and people worked on Monday, and those 5 days would be up and they automatically lose, and now they're blacklisted from renting another place. On top of this, 98% of landlords, when they go to housing court, have a lawyer. 2% of tenants do. So when you show up to court, you just like you respond to the notice, like you file a response, you show up to court, and like most people don't know how to navigate the court system and speak in front of a judge and defend themselves, especially against someone who kind of has that like legal training and background. The other thing I want to speak to is around kind of criminal justice. So in many places, landlords can just straight up refuse to rent to someone who has a criminal record, no matter how long ago that record was or kind of how minor that offense was. There's also this like narrative that people who are involved in the criminal justice system are somehow dangerous or bad or they did something wrong. However, what this fails to recognize is the deep structural and racial biases in our criminal justice system. Where do police police? Who are they more likely to pull over and arrest? For example, like the minimum sentencing. If you have crack cocaine, which more black people tend to use than say like white powder cocaine, which more like wealthy white people are to use. The sentencing requirement, it used to be 100 to 1, so like you had like say 1 gram, and I don't know what the measurements are, but say you have 1 gram, right, of crack versus cocaine. If you have crack, you are sentenced as if you have 100 times more than if you were to have powder cocaine. Under Obama, they reduced that to 17 to 1, but it's still a very it's a racialized sentencing system. There's also studies that show that black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. It's just there's so many racial biases embedded in our criminal justice system. So just to say, and then that follows you once you go to jail, once you leave, and you spend all that time in jail, you come out, that record follows you. Your past shouldn't control your future, but in many ways, if you have a criminal record, it closes many doors, quite literally. I'm gonna pause here and do a quick, and any questions about what I asked so far? All right.
You mentioned that the housing prices are not matching the median increase in wage. I'm curious if it matches the mean because maybe the median, because maybe it's like the top 2% owns all of the housing or something like that, and they're controlling the rest. So I'm curious about the statistic.
I actually don't know who controls housing. I know so I think median is actually a better way to measure kind of average income than, or to think about income than mean, just because we have such high, there's so many outliers. I don't think Jeff Bezos should be included.
Yeah, I'm just curious if that's actually the cause of the not matching, because maybe the mean actually matches and that's the problem.
I haven't seen anything in mean, but I think median would be a more rigorous way to understand this. It's really that the reason why rents have been going up so high is there's so many studies that can back this up, is we haven't built enough housing. To be a homeowner, it is more and more inaccessible, so there are wealthier people crowding out lower income people in the rental space. And then on top of that, I think there's this notion that, well, we can charge fair market rent because we'll charge what the market can bear. However, what the market can bear isn't really, housing isn't a commodity, it isn't an asset. It is a home in many ways. So I think, but in many ways, it is still treated from people who are property owners as a commodity. I don't know if that answered your question. All right. Any other questions about kind of what I presented so far? All right. I just want to do a quick check. Does anyone need to use the bathroom? I just want a few minutes. All right. I'm gonna keep going, and then maybe I'll check in at the end of this next section to see how we're doing. I just want to share a quick snapshot of, so we now understand kind of what are the main root causes of what causes homelessness. So what does homelessness look like in our community? So I want to do a snapshot of Santa Clara County, which includes kind of Palo Alto, where we are right now. In the Bay Area in 2017, over 25,000 people experienced homelessness. In California in 2020, over 160,000 people experienced homelessness on any given night. The main way that we count homelessness is through it's the point in time count. So one day in January, they get a lot of volunteers to go out into the city, into this region, and literally count how many people are sleeping on the street, in tents, in their vehicles, or in shelters. This is a gross undercount because it is not, because this is just one night and people may become homeless at other times of the year. And in addition to that, it doesn't count the housing unstable people who might be like bouncing around friends' homes or things like that. So for comparison, in 2020, the point in time count in California said that there are 160,000 people who experienced homelessness, but for the data system that the state manages, over 255,000 people access homelessness services in the year. So just to give you a little snapshot of that. The other thing that I want to share is you would ask the question of in San Diego, like the homelessness seems to be so much worse in San Diego. The thing is that than in the Bay Area, it seems to be worse in the Bay Area than in San Diego. The thing is that in California versus other places, we have higher rates of unsheltered homelessness. I don't know what the unsheltered homelessness rate is in San Diego, but in Santa Clara County, the unsheltered homelessness rate is 82%. That means of the people who are experiencing homelessness, 82% are not in a shelter fit for human habitation. So they are more likely to be on the street, they're more likely to be living in their cars, they're more likely to be squatting somewhere, they're more likely to be visible. So the perception of homelessness is worse in California than it is in other cities. The other misconception that people have about homelessness in California is that, oh, they're coming from other places, like we have good weather, we have better social services. That's not true. The data doesn't support this. 4 out of 5 people who are experiencing homelessness in Santa Clara County were in Santa Clara County before they became homeless. 57% of people were living in Santa Clara County long term, have been here for over 10 years. And on top of that, if they weren't from this area, they're probably from a neighboring county, like San Mateo or San Francisco or somewhere. I think this just underscores that people become homeless and experience homelessness in the region where they grew up, because this is where you have community, this is where you know people, and this is where you can't say like, oh, why don't they just move to like Fresno or Stockton where housing is cheaper. Like, this is people's homes, like if you think about it from that individual perspective. This is just really quickly to go over the difference between sheltered homelessness and unsheltered homelessness. Sheltered homelessness is like an emergency shelter, a transitional housing program, a safe haven, kind of somewhere where people who are experiencing homelessness can stay, kind of that is meant to house them, or to provide emergency shelter. Unsheltered homelessness, which is what we're seeing more of in the Bay Area in California, is when people are staying outdoors in tents, cars are on the street. Excuse me. So one thing that I want to show is in this graph right here. I'm sorry, I just have to cough, but I took a COVID test, so excuse me. What we see is that in New York, we actually have so many more people who are experiencing homelessness by both a count of number of people, but also per capita. However, if you see that only 5% of the population who is homeless are unsheltered. And this is, whereas compare that to Los Angeles, which is 75%, larger Greater Bay Area, which is 67%, and San Diego, which is 61%. So that might explain kind of why you think that San Diego, there is less perception of homelessness. There's a policy called right to shelter. This is guaranteed in certain state constitutions that says just like we have a right to privacy, we have a right to property, we have a right to free speech. There are some states have in their constitutions they guarantee a right to shelter, so the state has an obligation to provide emergency shelter. So places that have this right to shelter, like in New York, you see because the state is compelled to provide, they have to provide by law emergency shelter. So you see less street homelessness. Compare that with, say, Oakland in 2019. I think it was like 2019. I remember reading this stat when it was really, really rainy, and I was like, shoot, all these people who are living in encampments, this is so bad for them. The city was operating 476 units of beds in emergency shelters, and there were over 4,000 people on the streets. So we just do not have enough emergency shelters, period. There are also additional factors that increase the risk of homelessness. These stats in the graphics are stats for Santa Clara County. There are certain life experiences that make people more vulnerable. So one is domestic violence. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but people who are, it's largely women living in situations of domestic violence that have to leave their homes, have very little that support structure, and are nationally 4 times more likely to suffer from housing instability and homelessness. There is people who have been involved with the criminal justice system. Nationally, they are 10 times more likely than the general population to experience homelessness. In Santa Clara County, 1 in 4 people reported that they have been involved. They've been involved in the criminal justice system. This doesn't help with the fact that in many ways politicians are trying to arrest their way out of homelessness and criminalize being homeless. One thing that's really, really cool is in the last 10 years there was an appeal in the appeal courts, where it's the appellate court system. I don't know, in the western part of the region of the U.S. Where that decriminalized homelessness. It's a court case called Martin v. Boise, and it made it. This was in Boise, Idaho, where police were just arresting people who were sleeping on the street, and they saw that there just weren't enough shelters, and you can't arrest people for just being human when the state can't provide. So even though we have that court and constitutional protection now, there are still ways that a lot of local jurisdictions are making it illegal to be homeless. You can't park your RV somewhere, you can't sleep in a car, you can't put up an encampment somewhere. So what we're seeing is that more and more people are putting up their encampments right next to the trains, right next to the freeway overpasses, or under freeway overpasses, where they're less likely to get cited and encounter local resident opposition. The last thing that I'll bring up is the foster care system. There are huge racial biases embedded in the foster care system. This is where the government takes you from your family and your current living situations as a child for your own safety and for the benefit and safety of children, and places you in a different living condition. This can be extremely, extremely traumatic, and one of the outcomes of this is that people grow up, people exit the foster care system, and they have very little family support or support structure. If you guys were experiencing an issue with your housing, or if you have to move out in a week, most people will call their family. Many foster care children or people who have gone through the foster care system don't have that social safety net. So 1 in 5 people who are experiencing homelessness in Santa Clara County have been part of the foster care system. I was doing work with the Homelessness Services Clinic in Los Angeles, and I found this one stat that 50% of people exiting the foster care system end up within 1 year end up in jail or on the streets. This is how badly we are supporting our children. people also, there's also this conception that like people become homeless because they get addicted to drugs or alcohol or they make bad choices. However, in Santa Clara County, about a third of people cited job loss as the primary reason for their homelessness. If you just think about that video we saw kind of at the beginning, it was, Santa Clara County, 14% of people cited eviction as the primary reason for their homelessness. There is no social safety net, jobs pay far too little, and we've seen growing income inequality across the board, but it's really been acute in this like hub of like economic development and progress that is Silicon Valley. It's really benefited people who are high income earners, but for those who are earning, whose incomes are lower, they do not benefit from this economic growth. And what we've seen is that their real wages are actually declining over time while rents are getting more expensive. There's also that homelessness doesn't affect everyone equally. It is more likely to affect people who are Black residents, Native residents, and Latinos. Why is this? There is a legacy of racial discrimination in our housing system, in our criminal justice system, in our foster care system. Renters of color are more likely to be cost burden, and they're overrepresented in our carceral system. So what this comes out to is that the people that you see out on the streets are more likely to be Black and brown. And we see that in Santa Clara County. This is data for Santa Clara for 2019. I just want to speak, I'm going to try and speak very, very briefly, you can do an entire lifetime of research and work on this, that housing segregation and housing inequality and homelessness, and the homelessness that results from this is not the result of individual actions and individuals, it's not the result of individual actions. It is the intentional byproduct of decades of housing policies that have historically segregated and discriminated against people of color and continues to in really insidious ways. Some of the examples, this is a redlining, the map of kind of redlined Alameda County in Oakland, where I live right up there, where this is, if you guys have heard of or read Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, this is a map that shows that people who provided loans for home ownership, for homes, kind of looked at the racial composition of where people lived and assigned neighborhoods a certain color based on kind of their creditworthiness or loanworthiness. And neighborhoods that were majority Black were assigned red, thus redlined. The neighborhoods that were yellow were where mostly Asian people lived, and then green and blue are where mostly white people lived. And then the U.S. government kind of mortgages were based on maps like this, where you would only really give low interest loans or loans period to neighborhoods that were not redlined. So there's also just exclusion from home ownership programs, where in the 50s the federal government did a huge push to get more and more people to own homes and buy homes. Black people were not included in that. There's zoning in where you say, hey, in this neighborhood we're only going to build single family homes. We're not going to build any apartments. But apartments are what most low-income people are able to afford. So by refusing to build apartments and only zoning something, say single family, you end up not closing off that neighborhood to many, many people, including lower income people and people of color. We've also seen racially restrictive covenants where literally in the contract for the house, it says this house cannot be sold to someone who is Asian or Black. We've also seen kind of urban renewal, so the highways that have been built, BART that was built, it runs straight through where communities of color were living. I just think about, I grew up in Los Angeles, Dodger Stadium, they raised a Latino neighborhood that had been there for centuries in order to build that. And we have really strong property rights protected by the Constitution, but they were not provided just compensation for that. We've also, this continues to this day, with the 2008 foreclosure crisis. It really affected Black homeowners more than any other kind of categories of people, and it's because if you think about lending practices, like banks made many more predatory loans, those like ninja loans, no income, no assets, no problem, and like ballooning interests to Black homeowners. So as a result, Black households are less likely to own their homes than white households. When they succeed in purchasing their home and then they try and sell it, there's all this other discrimination. There's been like, there's been this study that was out in the New York Times a few years ago where you have like someone coming to appraise their home. Like before you sell your home, you have to say like, oh, this is how much like third-party appraisal says it's worth. If they see that a Black person they did this test looking at kind of if it was a Black family versus a white family, they get appraisals, and they found that across the board, if you are a white family, your home was appraised for more. So even if you are lucky enough to be a homeowner, your home, like there's all of this discrimination that continues to make it so Black households just end up gaining less wealth. I'm going to pause right here, and then I'm going to go into my final section around policy responses. Kind of any questions to this point?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the emergency shelter part, I'm assuming it's easier to build than affordable housing, right? Why is there still this, this gap, and also maybe potential reluctancy from the government to do this?
I'm going to get into this in my next section, but the issue is that people don't want to stay in emergency shelters as well. And in the last 10 years, what we've been how we've seen, there has been more and more data and research coming out that the best cure for homelessness is building more permanent housing and getting people housed. It's a housing first approach. So there has been a policy shift. Again, it's like prioritizing and negotiation, right? There's been a shift. So you've seen less transitional housing and less shelters being built, and more of those resources being dedicated to permanently finding permanent housing for people. And then there are all these other reasons why even if you have an emergency shelter, why people might not want to stay there. It's never meant to be it's not supposed to be a permanent solution. It's just a temporary Band-Aid.
How long can people stay in the emergency shelter?
It depends. It really, really depends. Some, you have to be out and re-register within a day, and they have really strict curfews. Others, you can stay maximum 90 days. A lot of homelessness service providers say the most important things about shelters is that they have to provide 3 P's. They have to allow your partner, they have to allow pets, and they have to allow for privacy. And many shelters don't allow for this.
So I'm actually very shocked at the map that you show with different colors, showing the different compositions of the races that occupy a certain region. So I was wondering how the system was designed and implemented when this was first. I was still back in the 50s or 60s, right? So how did they legalize this? I assume that there must be a lot of public opposition towards this. So I just wanted to know more about how this happened.
If you really want to learn more, I really recommend Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It is an incredible book, and it uses kind of the Bay Area as a case study. This was a really common practice. It was due to the work, I think, of a lot of advocates and lawyers. The 1963 Fair Employment and Housing Act that was passed kind of by Congress under Lyndon B. Johnson did away with considering race in in federal mortgages and in just the home buying process. So technically, you cannot consider race when you are looking at housing. It's a protected category. But I would say it was a really, really common practice, I think, just because of our history of racism in America. And there have been many efforts to to both restrict it. However, what we have now is that even if you are taking a race-blind approach, because of all of the inequities we have in our system that really disadvantages certain people, the impacts and the outcomes that you see are really disparate by race. So there's, it's getting a little wonky, but you can look at, now there's all this legislation to say that even if policies are not in their face, like racially, there isn't any racialized intent, if the impact has like disparate impacts by race, then that is illegal as well. So this is under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. I don't know if that answered your question though.
So that being said, this is no longer existing in the system.
No, but you see, but there are so many, there's so much information about this, but if you look at redlined maps, and then if you look at maps of like, where did the foreclosure crisis happen? Where did the eviction crisis happen? Where are more people who are, like, where is there most policing? Where is there the lowest air qualities? It almost all lines up with the red line maps. Like, housing fundamentally determines how clean air you breathe, like your transportation option, what school you go to, what your income is, like safety. So just, even though we don't have maps like this, there are other ways that the impacts of this from 70 years ago still linger on in today's society.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you remind me of the name of the book again?
Color of Law.
Okay, thank you so much.
What is foreclosure?
Pardon?
What is foreclosure?
Foreclosure, yeah. So it's like when you, great question. It's like when you rent a home, when you go to buy a home, basically the most common way that people purchase a home is with a 30-year mortgage. Foreclosure happens when you can no longer afford that mortgage payment, so then the bank comes and takes that house away from you.
I got a question. So, sorry, you just mentioned the right to shelter and the litigation. I just wonder, is there any like constitutional argument, like right to privacy, like abortion right, on that in terms of litigation? Because I came from Irvine, I used to live in Irvine, Orange County, and I've heard that Irvine PD, they're like getting the homeless people on the street and put them somewhere else, like outside Irvine. So if there's any like constitutional argument so that we can stop this from happening. Yeah.
I don't know about constitutional arguments. I'm sorry, I kind of want to chew on that a little bit more, but there, like, from what I've known, like, there hasn't, I think there are, like, human rights arguments for it, and also, like, due process issues, like procedural arguments that maybe advocates can use, but I don't know, like, what the, like, one, because this was an issue, too, like, with COVID, they were saying, like, oh, encampments, we're going to see, like, a big boom. So you've had, like, in Oakland, like, there was just massive sweeps of homeless encampments. And there have been so many stories of people losing all of their belongings, including their identification and birth certificate and their computers, like, in those sweeps. And I haven't followed yet kind of what the main reasons for, like, how they got them to stop those encampments. I think a lot of it was more like political pressure than like a court order. But I don't know. I'm gonna do more research on this.
I'm gonna say that we should take a 10-minute break and then resume at 4 o'clock, and so people can use the bathroom with the help from people who have access to the bathrooms.
And then we'll get into policy responses, and then I'll take more questions. And then this is the last section. Thank you.
Thank you. Please take a seat. Okay, and maybe we should start with a question.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Wait, also, before, I should have asked this, but before, can you give me your name and where you're coming from? Sure. Yeah.
My name is Alice.
Hi,
Thanks
Alice.
for doing the presentation today.
Thank you. I like your shirt.
May the forest be with you.
Thank you. And with you.
The question I was thinking was about people who used to be homeless and managed somehow to be owning a home or renting again. Like, what are the success stories? What can we learn? Like, how can you teach more people to become less homeless?
What are the typical
I
personas?
think I don't think there's just like one archetype of someone who is able to like get out, like find permanent housing. I think ultimately it's an entire system that's working. So what I really want to do is like not focus it on like what is that one person's journey and what is like did they work hard? Did they find a job? But rather like, is the system working? Because homelessness is a systemic problem rather than an independent problem, an individual problem. I think one thing that research has shown that works is placing them in housing and really making sure that people have supportive housing. So I'm gonna actually get into that in the solution section. But I mean, I think there's like a craving. One thing that like I'm hearing from you is just like a real desire to hear people's stories. And I think this is something that like we can all do better at, of like listening, like looking for and listening to stories, not because whenever we think about and talk about homelessness in the media and amongst like policymakers and amongst ourselves, it's always like, what is the impact of homelessness on homeowners? What is the impact of homelessness on us? We never really talk about what is the impact of homelessness on the person who is homeless. So I think this is like maybe a call to action for us to just do a better job to hearing people's stories, because they are the real experts of what worked for them.
I saw a story on Quora, I think it was on Quora, somebody had taught a San Francisco homeless person pipeline, and they actually got a job and stopped being homeless.
Yeah, but job training is a huge thing that works.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from like expert like you, it's like, for people like us who don't have much time, maybe you have a little bit but not much money, what is the best way to help the problem?
Yeah, can I do you like have your, why don't you send me an email, I'll get your contact info. I think there's a lot we can do, but ultimately there's for some, it all depends on like what you're individually able to do and want to do and can do.
I mean for like just normal,
Yeah, the way that I've shown up is that like, for example, like people who are living in like encampments, like they can't cook. So like I've like shown up to like things where you you made a ton of burritos and passed it out, so at least like they're like you address like the food insecurity that someone might. There's also so many organizations that like take like clothing donations, that take if they have a job training or a workforce training to do something like that too, like that they take volunteers, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Tenants Together.
Oh, and Tenants Together, yeah, this is thank you. This is the nonprofit that my husband Neil and I volunteered at, which was, they ran a statewide hotline for people who are renters and they're experiencing evictions or rent increases or just like landlord harassment, and we basically educated them on what their rights are, because so many people who are renters don't know what their rights are. So if the landlord says, I'm going to increase your rent, they're like, okay, like maybe you can, or like you need to leave. It's like they think maybe I can, because there's that power that landlords have over you, and the kind of like, it's like losing your home is one of the scariest things that you can go through. So Tenants Together is a volunteer-based hotline where they have a training to educate you on what tenant protections are in the state, and then you talk to real people who are at risk of being homeless to tell them about their rights and what they can do about it. So look them up, Tenants Together.
So I noticed that, at least like from my impression, that a lot of people who became homeless, that is visible, seemingly having like psychiatric disorders, and how crucial or big is this in the actual like unsheltered and homeless population?
Yeah.
And also just an observation, not backed by statistics. I feel like where I come from, China, it has I think there's more family support on like people who are adults that have mental illness or like psychiatric disorders, but there seems to be like less of that like societal support. And is there any way to provide support to people who are maybe not capable of making money?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is my question.
That's such a good question. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it is true many people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness have some form of mental illness. And the way that it manifests might be kind of like psychiatric episodes where they don't have the right diagnosis and the medication to treat it. Or it might be like they might self-medicate either through substances or alcohol. The thing is that if you are on the streets and if you don't have housing instability, that is going to make it so much worse. So I'm actually going to, this is going to be like a segue into kind of the next section of my presentation, which is this is also a historical, like a consequence of historical policy decisions. Surprise, dating back to Reagan, where there was a massive effort to deinstitutionalize people, because there used to be state-run kind of facilities for people with mental illness. There was a whole scale, but they would have awful conditions, and like many human rights were being violated, like medical rights were being violated. So the response to this is we're going to close down these institutions. But the thing is that the money that was spent on those institutions never got redirected into providing other forms of care. So what we're seeing is a consequence of this historical disinvestment in mental health care in America, and the fact that experiencing homelessness just makes all these conditions so much harder, which is why when it's like there isn't an easy solution, but one solution that this evidence-backed is this housing first model and permanent supportive housing. So putting people in housing and making sure that there's mental health supports, making sure there's a social worker, making sure that there's employment supports and workforce development and training. So that permanent supportive housing is really important. It's just really friggin' expensive and hard to build, like physically hard to build for all of the reasons I had explained. And the other thing I would just point to is that 1 in 4 people in Santa Clara County who are homeless are products of the foster care system. If you are coming out of the foster care system, that family support that you might have if you're going through a really hard time doesn't exist. No, it's a big structural issue, which is why I want to shift away the conversation from it, what is the individual pathway out of homelessness to how do we change our systems and structures to better support, so we don't continue creating more homelessness conditions that make people vulnerable to homelessness.
I'm going to answer one comment before we move on to the next part of the presentation. I've noticed that people are interested in how racial history, the segregation, and it were intertwined with the housing situation we have today. Actually, back in 2020, we have done one program that's numbered episode 16 on our YouTube channel. If you want to look at it, we had a talk from Bedafe who did an in-depth analysis over this issue. So that's, again, episode 16.
Thank you. Yeah, just because I gave such a cursory overview, oh my god, 0.001% of the information out there. So I really, talk to me after and I can point you to more resources to learn more about the kind of racialized structures and systems and the historical racism that led to the housing crisis. Any last questions before I finish up my presentation? Okay. All right. So one thing I do want to point out is that we're actually doing a lot. California is doing a lot to address this homelessness crisis. So this is data from Los Angeles, I think back in looking at 2018 to 2019. So just kind of backing out, in Los Angeles, 721,000 households are severely cost burdened, which means that they pay more than half of their income on housing. So that's 721,000 people. Of that, kind of starting at the start of 2018, when the point in time count in January was counted, there were 52,000 people who were experiencing homelessness. Over the course of 2018, you had about 55,000 people enter into homelessness for the first time, or who were falling back into homelessness kind of after they had been housed. But over the course of 2018, through our homelessness system, people were placed in homes And people found housing themselves, like kind of maybe they were able to, like if they got like a month like rental assistance, they were able to like find somewhere, and they just got a job again and were able to, you know, it's like all of these different pathways to finding home. However, because this number is much higher than this number, you end up having that you end 2019, you start 2019, you end 2018, you start the year with more people homeless than you started the year with. So we are doing a lot, but more and more people are falling into homelessness, so it's kind of like you're taking 2 steps forward, but you're taking 3 steps back. In fact, in Santa Clara County, for every 2 people they put into housing, 3 more people become homeless. So it's literally 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So this is why we just have to take a prevention approach, not just like how do we fix the problem now, but how do we prevent more people from becoming homeless in the first place. We've been talking about emergency shelters. There was a question about like, why don't we spend more on emergency shelters? Do they work? They are a Band-Aid short-term solution. They play a really important role when someone is lose their home and need somewhere to sleep at night. However, it alone is not enough to fix the homelessness crisis. There's also so many stories of people who are like, who say that, who find shelter, who choose not to go into a shelter, or like, it's a very, very traumatic experience for them. So like I mentioned, you can't take partners. If you have families, there are less spaces available, like family shelters, there are fewer spots available. So people don't want to split up from their siblings, they don't want to split up from their children, they don't want to split up from their husband or boyfriend or whatever. So they don't seek out the shelter system. They don't allow pets. There are many, many people who, like, when I think about pets, like, Kobe's like my emotional support sometimes. Like, there's no friggin' way I'm gonna give him up. And yet most emergency shelters don't allow pets. And when they can be critical kind of like mental health supports for people. Many emergency shelters are run by religious organizations who place a sobriety requirement, saying like you can't come here if you're like on drugs or if you're drinking. However, like if there are addiction issues, like you need to be housed first before you can address these issues. The other thing is that I know many shelters that say, okay, you have to be here to sign in by like 7 p.m. However, the line is going to be so long because the intake process is so long, so you really have to start getting in line at 3 p.m. and it's just somewhere for you to go to bed, so you have to wake up by 7 a.m. because they kick you out by 9 a.m. So it's really just like a stopgap solution for you to spend your night, but it is not going to be a permanent solution. They also don't allow any storage, so where do you put your stuff? If you just think about from the perspective of someone who, if you were to lose your housing one day, think about all of the logistical issues that you have to go through, and shelters don't provide that. It can also be really, really unsafe and traumatic and dirty, and there's lots of reporting of there's a very big us versus them reaction that staff have. They don't treat people with kindness and dignity. It's like basically being in a prison. It's what I've heard. So there is evidence-backed research that shows that, again, the way out of homelessness is to put people in homes. You address homelessness by connecting people to housing, and it's now this approach, it's called the housing first approach, which is what at the federal level and at the state level is, and they say that if you're going to be investing in homelessness, you need to be taking this housing first approach, where the primary priority is to place people in a house. It's not just to provide them shelter. Again, there are trade-offs with this because we only have a limited amount of money we can spend on it. So it's at the expense, placing people in homes can be really expensive, but then you don't have enough money to build emergency shelters. So it is a trade-off. The types of housing that falls under this housing first approach, I would say the gold standard is permanent supportive housing. So this is, you place someone in a unit, say it's a 1-bedroom apartment or it's a studio apartment, and in this building there's a social worker, a mental health worker, there's a primary care physician, there's places to connect you to jobs, that connect you to social services, that sign you up for like a food stamps, general assistance, etc. It's housing plus all of these supportive services. There's also rapid rehousing, which is like maybe a place where someone can go for 6 months to 24 months just to get someone housed until they stabilize. There's also like specific approaches based on kind of like what your like life experience is. For example, I know that there are group homes for families, like mothers and families, or there are specific homes for like veterans or for homeless youth. And the reason why it's so complicated is because in California alone, just in California, there are 44 different homelessness programs and types of funding run by 9 different departments, and they don't all speak to each other. It is so confusing to navigate. I've tried to study this and like it made like a big chart of like who funds what, like how do you get funding for what, and the lack of coordination is just staggering. And then finally, what a lot of with the homelessness system is also more and more focusing on, which I think is really wonderful, is around homelessness prevention. How do you prevent people from getting homeless in the first place? So that's like, how do you get them rental assistance? How do you make people not lose their homes so they don't end up having to use the system in the first place? So I think this just underscores like you need a home in order to stabilize. Like you need a house before you can focus on anything else, including focusing on your health, getting a job. For example, when you ask people like why, like what are the barriers to finding permanent supportive housing? In Santa Clara County, I think 56% said that we can't find a job, you don't have a job or an income. But think about it, when you apply for a job, you need an address. You need a good night's sleep so you can show up in the morning and do your job. Like I worked in a drop-in shelter. I was working with the drop-in shelter, and there was a young person for homeless young people in Los Angeles. And this young person was saying, look, I got this job through this like program. However, I can't sleep because I'm so afraid. I'm sleeping out on the street. I'm so afraid I'm going to get attacked. I'm so afraid all my things are going to get stolen. So I'm only sleeping like 2 hours a night. So he's showing up to work and he's like falling asleep at work. And so then he loses his job after 3 months. Like it's one of those things where like housing is so fundamental. Just having safe housing is so fundamental before you can do anything. So there are several policy solutions, kind of they fall into 4 different buckets. The first is kind of where I started my presentation of we need more affordable housing, period. The second is we need to improve the homelessness response system so it serves people's actual needs and it is more trauma informed and people want to use it. The third is we need to actually strengthen our homelessness prevention policies, so like better tenant protection, more rental assistance. And then the fourth is providing more supports for lower income families, including employment and higher wage and livable wages. So that kind of that gap between wage and income, wage and rent will shrink. So this first one is, this is where I can get like really, really wonky, but I'm going to try and tone it down. But if you want to find me afterwards to talk about state housing policy, like I'd love to do that. What we need is we need more affordable housing and we need more affordable housing near places where there are jobs, where there is public transportation, and where there are social services. There are many, many policies at the state level that are trying to work towards making it easier to build affordable housing. Kind of one example that I'll give you is SB Senate Bill 35. What this does is that for certain housing projects that meet an affordability threshold, so like maybe half the units in this development is going to be affordable, it makes it easier for the approval process. And it makes the permitting and approval process faster and easier. So you don't have cities like San Francisco or Mountain View where you're saying like, no, you need to provide this and this and this and taking years to approve. It just makes it, you get by right like approval, which means that if you check these boxes, then yeah, we'll approve you. So it just makes it faster. You also have the density bonus law at the state level. I'm seeing some nods from some architectures and planners probably. What this means is that if you have a certain amount of your housing is affordable, then it allows you to build higher, more dense. If you want to, we talked about the rising cost of development. One way that developers can get around this is that for a plot of land, they can build more units so they can get more rent. However, many cities have a cap on how high you can build your building, so the density bonus law allows you to bypass that if a certain amount of your housing development is for affordable units. There's also kind of more interesting, this is where my intellectual curiosity is, how do we get housing off of the speculative market, so housing is no longer something that we can, that property owners and developers and landlords try and make money off of. How do we keep it permanently affordable? So there are different models like community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives that buy land and buy a building and have more social governance, deed restricted housing that makes it so that that has it in the actual contract of the housing so that the rents are stabilized over time. And then finally, I would say we need to reduce barriers for affordable housing development and any development in really wealthy exclusionary neighborhoods. So I'm thinking the Woodsides, the Athertons, even to an extent the Palo Altos and the Mountain Views that say we don't want more housing because this will lower our home values. We need less of a no in my backyard and a yes in my backyard approach. The second kind of policy, I guess, area of policies is to improve the homelessness system. Kind of what this graphic is showing is that, I'm gonna get wonky here again, is that so the federal government, most of the homelessness money that cities and counties can spend is given to us by the federal government. The federal government, they don't just give it to the state, they give it to what they call a continuum of care, which is a regional kind of organization of shelters, of social service workers, of the departments of social services. There are 44 of them in California, and they operate this coordinated entry system. Before this, these are people who are losing their homes. They're how do we navigate this maze to get into housing? They don't know which shelter to call. They don't know where, if there's availability. The goal with a more improved coordinated entry system is that you're able to assess kind of what people's needs are. Do you need rental assistance? Do you just need a hotel for a week? Do you need to be placed in a family shelter? What are your housing needs if you're experiencing housing instability? They have a centralized data system where they can see okay, 10 people are calling in and they need emergency shelters. Where are the shelters here based that have available beds? How do we get people? Because think about it, we don't really have a great public transit system. So it's sometimes navigators are literally calling lifts for people just to get them to shelters. They assist people to get the shelters, and then after they're there, they assign them kind of more permanent housing solutions. So this is what a coordinated entry system is supposed to do. However, kind of at every step of this, there are issues. There are opportunities to improve what the system can look like for people who are experiencing them. So this first part is the shelter system is, again, like I mentioned, it can be incredibly traumatic, unsafe, restrictive, so people want to avoid, so how can we restructure it and create it so it's a place where, an affirming place for people to go? One way that that advocates have been pushing is to create more non-congregate shelters. So none of these and more privacy. Because I don't want to sleep in a bunk bed with 20 other people when you're coughing and it's just it's not a dignified place to stay. The other thing is that the staff, there have been a lot of complaints about the people who work there, how they aren't compassionate and how they just end up re-traumatizing people. So better staff training, really making sure that the people who have lived experience of homelessness are the ones who are working and supporting people who are going through this, because they know what, they are they are experts of this homelessness system. And the other thing, another policy solution is, how do we change the definition of homelessness? So the way, in this part, in the assessed part, the way that a continuum of care assesses kind of given the limited capacity that our system has to support people, they have an assessment tool to see what are, how high priority is this person. Under this, it means that people who have experienced chronic homelessness, so who have been on the streets for a lot longer and who have all of these other kind of risk factors, are placed higher priority than the people who are and then if you're a family, then you're placed higher priority than maybe an individual. This ends up leaving out a lot of people in ways that are really inequitable. So for example, something that I've heard from someone who's worked from a homelessness system says that Black people are much less likely to be I am homeless. They're oh no, I'm couch surfing, I have this place to go. But the thing is that when you're doing the VI spit out the assessment, you need to be no, I am chronically homeless. So it's how do we make it so we end up really assessing what people's needs are rather than leading to kind of more inequitable prioritization kind of assessments. This third kind of area of policies is strengthening the homelessness prevention suite of policies. So this is really kind of where my heart lies. So the first is this needs to be done at a federal level. We need more rental assistance. This is the biggest amount of money comes from the federal government, and they have not been increasing the number of Section 8 vouchers. So really if you are low income, you get a voucher, you find an apartment on the private market, and say the apartment costs $2,000, but you can only pay $300. The federal government comes in and pays the $1,700, that gap. They haven't expanded that. This is a list that I explained in Berkeley, has been closed since 2012. We need to expand this. For example, food stamps, healthcare, these are all entitlements. We're all entitled to this if our income is really low. Every low-income person in America can just get these benefits, but that is not the case for housing vouchers, for rental assistance. Why? I think housing is just as important as food and just as important as healthcare. Why isn't this an entitlement? Other thing is we need stronger renter protections. This is where if you want to learn more, this is kind of this is what Tenants Together is really advocating for. So we need stronger eviction protections, so people can't be kicked out of their home just because the landlord feels like it. So the landlord needs a just cause to evict you. We have a loose level of this at the state, but I think Mountain View just passed stronger protections in 2020, but there can be so much more done at a local level. We need real rent control. I think right now at the state, it's just so complicated, but at the state, your rent can go up if you're in a rent controlled building you can't go up by more than 10%. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, kind of like the family that we heard, your rent goes up by $150, your income's not going up by that much, so you lose your housing. And the other thing is that I think one of the benefits of being a homeowner is that you know exactly how much your payment is going to be over 30 years. There is that stability. Rent control can provide that stability if we have strong enough protections. So renters can experience that stability and have those protections that homeowners do with rent control. There's also anti-harassment policies. So there is a big power imbalance if you are a landlord versus a tenant, where you are, as a renter, you are really depending on one person and being in the good graces of one person to not lose the roof over your head. So when a landlord some of the cases that I've worked with at Tenants Together, some renters have experienced sexual harassment, physical harassment, racial harassment from landlords, and they feel like they don't have power to fight back because they don't want to lose their housing. Because once they're this is a rent controlled house. If I get kicked out and move somewhere else because my landlord is angry with me, all the rents have gone up by $1,000, I won't be able to afford it. So it just makes renting so much more precarious, and anti-harassment policy is going to provide a framework of some protections. There's also right to counsel, which is guaranteeing legal representation for people going through evictions. that stat that I showed you, that I talked about, 98% of landlords have a lawyer, 2% of tenants have a lawyer. San Francisco passed right to counsel in 2017, and what they found is that the number of evictions went down by more than 30%, which just goes to show that 1 in 3 evictions then were like once landlords were like, oh shoot, the tenant's gonna have a lawyer, I'm not gonna file this eviction, because they knew that they couldn't win in court. When tenants had legal representation, more than 60% of them won their case. Which just goes to show that legal right to counsel can end up protecting people from being evicted, and even if they don't win their case, it buys them more time. It allows them to figure out what their next step is going to be instead of being rushed out of their home so quickly. And then there's fair chance housing, which eliminates the use of, it prohibits the use of criminal background checks and rental applications. So this is, you've heard of ban the box in employment. So when you're applying for a job, you are no longer able to put a box that says, I have a criminal history, or a felony or a misdemeanor. Because if you are an employer or if you're a landlord, you look at that and you have a big pile of applications, you're probably automatically going to dismiss everyone who checks that box. This means that they that is just discrimination for landlords to not even look at the individual merits of that person and just say reduce who they are to whether they check that box or not. This is no longer allowed in employment, and what I've been working on this summer is to make sure that it's no longer allowed in housing. A landlord should be able to judge is this going to be a safe person? Are they going to be able to pay rent? Is this is this going to I need to be worried about my financial security, my financial investment in this building, my the safety of the tenants. However, reducing people to just what their past mistakes have been is it's not the answer to providing expanding housing security. And finally, we need to make sure that families, that there is more economic equality and support for lower income people. Instead of lower income families, but just all people, not just families. This housing crisis is not just a crisis brought on by the homelessness crisis is not just a housing crisis issue. It's also the fact that wages have not gone up. It's an income inequality issue. So anything we can do to help reduce that income inequality is really important. So making sure people get paid livable wages. I think the minimum wage in Santa Clara is $15 or something like that, which is so low. You can't afford a house with that. So we really need to make sure that the minimum wage goes up. If you're a homeowner, you can get your your mortgage interest deducted and get a tax credit, tax deduction for that. Why can't renters? So it's how do we support lower income families and lower income renters? There's so much more that can be done at a policy level, but I know that all of you are here right now because you are interested in learning more. Thank you so much for coming and spending your Saturday listening to me talk about housing and homelessness. And there's so many more resources to if you want to learn more and just to dig deeper. The one that I would really recommend if you want to learn more about what the homelessness system is and hear it from a perspective of someone someone who is unhoused, trying to figure out where they're going to sleep at night, the 99% Invisible podcast. They have a series called According to Need. It's a 5-part series that follows someone who is homeless and what their journey is. There's also We the Unhoused. It's another podcast. This is created by people who are homeless in Los Angeles, talking about what their story is about different issues. There are 2 books that I cannot recommend enough. The first book is Evicted by Matthew Desmond. He's a Princeton sociologist. He also created the Eviction Lab, which tracks how many evictions happen in America and who is evicting. And what we have learned from his research is that evictions are a business strategy for many property owners without really thinking about the human consequences of what an eviction does for a family. And then there's The Color of Law, which is the totem, it's like the book, the Bible for kind of like racial equity in housing. So like, what are the housing policies that have systematically excluded Black and brown people from owning homes and from building from having cities really invest in lower income neighborhoods. And then kind of in the last front about like, what are some like community things that are happening is that there are, Yes in My Backyard is this big movement that came really out of the Bay Area and have expanded to other cities. So it's countering the No in My Backyard NIMBYism with the Yes in My Backyard, like let's build more housing, let's build more affordable housing. They have different chapters in the Bay, in like different cities. I know there are many in like the Peninsula, in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto, in Mountain View. So I would say just look at your local group for YIMBY. They do meetups once in a while to do more education, to like go to city council if there's a vote on affordable housing. Because I would say like affordable housing succeeds and both dies in like the boring vacuums of city council meetings that no one really goes to except for people who have the time and care about this, which is like me and homeowners. And then I sometimes drag my husband along. But like, you now have more like community activism with people who have realized what the consequence of not participating in our local democracy has been. And so I would say the YIMBY groups are pretty great at that. And that is it. Really appreciate your time. I know I've been talking for a while, and
thank you for your time. Really appreciate a lot of good information packed in 2 hours here. Any questions before we wrap up?
Yes. Can I have a comment and a question? I think the comment or the thought leads to that question. So coming from an economic background, I've heard debates around some of the policy responses, especially something like a financial subsidy for low-income people. It does solve the problem for people who receive those subsidies, but they're always, and in reality, a lot of people don't get it. But
one in four.
Yeah, and by supply and demand, the house price become more expensive because of this distortion to the market. So I wonder what you think about those policies, and should we still be doing it? And another question actually is, what are the political movements right now in Bay Area that you're aware of that's trying to increase the supply of housing just in general, just not limited to affordable housing, because that seems to be the key issues. Yeah, even for the more expensive residential housing, how can we build more and make the buildings higher and accommodate more people?
Okay, so to your, what was your first question again?
The subsidy
policy. Yeah, so there's been a lot of research about the issue of like, if we give everyone rental assistance and like a voucher, you're gonna end up flooding the market with renters, and there isn't enough supply for it. I think you have to take a really, really nuanced view to this. This may be the case in coastal cities that have really high housing supply issues, like the Bay Area. However, there are places like, say, like Detroit or like Minneapolis, you know, where we have a lot more empty homes, and the issue that people have is that they don't have enough money to pay for those rents. So I think it is, you will have an issue in California if you end up just flooding it with housing vouchers if you don't build more housing in addition to that. So it's like, you need like a combination of these policies. But I think ultimately it doesn't mean that we can't start having this conversation about expanding rental assistance to people who need it. Because like the California context is so different from like the Idaho context. But the thing is that the housing crisis is not just a California problem, it's a United States problem. So I hope that answers and addresses your first question. So it's nuanced and complicated, and you should have a place-based regional approach. the second question is around, like, yes, we need more housing, period. Like, a lot of the people who are coming in, like the 500,000 jobs that were created in the Bay, a lot of them were higher income jobs. And the fact that is that we need to build more housing across the board. However, so there is a lot of movement to do that. I think the YIMBY groups are a big one. There's also a lot of the policies coming out of the state to streamline development and make it like easier to do, address both market rate development and affordable housing development. I think the issue is that we are overbuilding. We are building the up to like. We're not we are making progress toward building market rate development, but it is not at the pace that we needed to. And we also need to be building the affordable housing. So like, yes, we need a market rate, but we also really need affordable. And if you look at what cities are building, they're building market rate, but they're not building affordable.
Thank you. I have a question.
Yes.
So this is based on my own observations. I feel like the Not in My Backyard campaign is much more influential than Yes in My Backyard. And that's pretty understandable in my understanding, because people have this stereotype for homelessness. Admittedly, I saw you show us the clip from John Oliver that most of the people who are homeless are normal people who just don't have enough money. But usually those standing out are those people who yell at you at the street, who happen to be more aggressive.
Yeah, there's this perception that homeless people are dangerous. And
yes.
Yeah.
And when you're heard that your neighborhood, your community is going to be building a new affordable house or permanent affordable house, like it is very incentive for you to object it based on your this stereotype and based on like your concern over your family, especially when you have kids. So how do you propagate this? How does the Yes in My Backyard start to influence more people to believe these are the wrong stereotype? Because not everybody has the time to spend or interested in spending more time to understand this community, homeless people, like what you do, or they just based on their own observations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a big. This is, I think, why stories really matter, because I think one thing that I've realized over and over again during doing policy work and doing community advocacy work is that data only gets you so far. I can just yell numbers at people, but the thing is, if you have had one bad experience, you're going to be blind to all of the other data that shows the people who are going to be housed in affordable housing are mostly old people, they're mostly veterans, they're mostly families, they're mostly individuals who've like lost their jobs. They're just like people like you and me who've just had different life experiences. But if you've had one bad experience of like being attacked or just, it colors the impression. So I think one thing that's really important is like, how do we change that narrative? And I think this is a role that like the media can take, right? I think we do a lot of coverage of like, here's more crime around this, but it's like why don't we do coverage around like more people who are just like you and me going through the system? So I think it's more of a narrative strategy that has to be coupled with policy. And I think it really comes with just when I do this work, I actually felt really uncomfortable deciding to do this presentation because I don't think I'm an expert in homelessness because I have never experienced homelessness. I think there is a deep expertise that comes from someone who've had that lived experience, and they should be the ones that we listen to. And I think we can do a better job as a society and like as policymakers or in the media of like really centering those people who have that experience. So I don't know if this answers your question. This is a really, really tough one because I think like this is the reason why Trump won, right? It's because fear is so much more powerful than hope and like solidarity and humanity. It is more of a motivating factor to get people to show up and to oppose something if you're afraid of something. And I think this is what like the NIMBY movement really counts on. So thank you for showing up and learning more, and I think it's like more like this. It's like talking to your friends and being more compassionate and just trying to like center what people might be going through. And like if you see someone who's like going through like having a psychiatric breakdown in the middle of the street, it's like what were the life experiences that led someone to this? And like the thing is also like if you're building affordable housing, like crime does not go up. Like it doesn't. The data shows that it doesn't. Yeah, I don't know.
Hi, Agnes.
Yeah.
So just for my curiosity, so if I'm homeless tonight, how could I exactly get help? I just like waiting for some volunteer to pick me up on the street, or?
So you're okay. So you got home, your landlord just like kicked you out, and you have no one to call who you can get in touch with. Call 211. They are in this area. They're the ones that the coordinated entry system that I was talking about. They're like they help funnel and like direct you. It's like the information and referral section. So 211 is probably the most immediate place there you can call. And then if you just like the city of Palo Alto or the city of like Santa Clara County, they probably on their website have different shelters and like navigation places that you can call.
So I live in Civic Center in San Francisco before, so the homeless people I encounter with is kind of different. You know, like I don't think if they will like reach out to you for the help by themselves, so how would other things to help them? Like things kind of goes two ways, right? I can reach out for help if I know the information, but there are many homeless that don't know the information. How would they get help?
It also might be that they might know the information because there is a lot of street outreach that many homeless like outreach like navigation centers do, where they go out to encampments to make sure like, hey, like we're gonna put you in our system, we're gonna assess you, we're gonna like make sure we know about you so we can help you. However, there have been many people who have been burnt by that system, who have been like traumatized by it, who don't want to follow all of the really like strict restrictions that are placed by shelters, who might have gotten harassed or assaulted in the shelter. So again, this is like, if you've had a bad experience, you kind of shut off to it. So I think like when in like the case of like the example that you're talking about in San Francisco, I think there is both like people might not know about it, but they might just be really reluctant to access it. They might also be in the system already and just waiting to get permanent housing. So they might be able to access emergency shelters, but for all the reasons I mentioned, they might not want to stay in that shelter, but they're waiting for more permanent housing, and that permanent housing, there's too few of it, and that wait list is really, really long. And the system itself, like the administrative system, is like really complicated. Or sometimes they might say, oh, okay, like we did your application here, like you need to show up for an appointment on the other side of town, but you don't have a BART card, like you don't know how to like navigate, like you don't have a cell phone to like call Lyft, you don't have money to do that. So I think like the best homeless outreach is like actually like doing that kind of like advocacy in that casework.
So we have two more questions here.
Hi, my name is Lian San. I just came from City Center from San Francisco. It's where like the homeless party was. I'm curious that I saw you mentioned this Yes in My Backyard movement, but as I understand, it's more like a voluntary movement that some people volunteer to accept affordable housing there. And what we see from this volunteer action is that when you have some part of the group doing the great things and another part of the group not doing the great things, we often let the market to decide, and those communities that without affordable housing became the better housing that show us on Zillow and other places where homeowners are trying to buy. And a lot of the opposing forces for those affordable housing are the homeowners. So I was wondering, is there any possibility of a mandatory program that, for example, like if your community does not have affordable housing, you're paying more household taxes, you're paying more on some other things that homeowner really cares. Is it something in place?
Yeah, what's like the stick? Yeah, because you can have the carrot, which is like, this is our collective responsibility, right? And then you have like, I think there needs to be a stick. I was just talking about this. There's this, it's called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, AFFH. What this does is, again, like I mentioned, like every 8 years, the state does like an analysis of like, okay, for each city, like based on how many people, like your income and like job growth and whatever, like this is how much housing you need to build. And it's for the longest time, it's been a recommendation. And cities are like, oh yeah, we're gonna do it, and then they don't actually do it because there's no stick to it. Right now, what we have is that it's tied to other state funding. So if you don't build, then the state is going to take away like important like transportation money. So you won't get money to fix your street. You won't get money to like for your public transit or for your buses. So you better build. Or they have the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta, is a huge like housing rights person. So he's like, we're going to sue you. We're going to like actually sue the city if you don't do this. I know, Kobe.
Sorry, is it state level or city level?
That's at the state level. So affirmatively furthering fair housing is a state mandate that every city has to affirmatively further the like building of more housing and equitable housing.
Okay, so one of the like side effects I can think of right now is like maybe the state just pick a like trashy place to put all of their
They can't do that.
there.
They can't do that because this is a history of like public housing, right? Like in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the federal government gave a lot of money to housing authorities at like the local level to build public housing that the government operates and manages and owns. They only built it in places that were lower income, higher crime, and neighborhoods of color. And it led to overcrowding. They didn't supplant it and supplement it with like increased services. Like if so many people live somewhere and you don't, and more people live there, like you need more trash pickup. You need more like city light, like lights. You need more services. But they include that in that investment. What this led to was a further segregation of public housing and low-income housing in lower income and communities of color. And what we have seen there has been like legislative and legal advocacy through the courts to look at disparate impacts of these racial, in only building public housing and low-income housing in these neighborhoods and non-rich neighborhoods. So they have been able to show that, like, look, statistically, like all of your low-income housing money is going to poor neighborhoods and none's going to rich neighborhoods. And what this creates is more racialized segregation based on the fact that more people using low-income housing are people of color. And therefore, this is a Fair Employment and Housing Act violation. So this is where affirmatively furthering fair housing comes from. It was like Obama explored this in 2012, and California is like really buckling down on it. So I think right now it's like a really exciting time because people are finally being like, Atherton, you gotta build. Like Woodside, you gotta build. And they're like, oh no, it's neighborhood character. Like we're gonna refuse this and not build. But now the state actually has teeth that they can like to enforce these laws. So there's a lot of conversation about this. I think the NIMBYs are trying to make it really, really difficult, which is why the state is coming in with like all of these policies to make it easier to build housing. So that local opposition, that homeowner opposition I think sometimes it is important, like I think we're a democracy and there is a community process, but often who uses that to do what ends up meaning that like low-income housing and affordable housing gets squashed.
Okay, one final question before the program wraps up, and feel free to stay by the courtyard after the program's end.
I think this is both a question and a shout out / advertisement. I think one question is that one of the biggest cause of housing crisis in the Bay Area, especially the South Bay, is Silicon Valley, with the high salary tech workers like me myself, are displacing
and like most of my friends, right? Yes, this is why we all came here, because of the jobs. Yeah.
Yes, are displacing, paying for the higher rents. Are there any ways to hold like the 1%, which are the tech companies, more accountable in solving those issues? And along with this, because at Stanford there is a project called Scope 2035. Stanford, let's see what the full name is. Stanford Coalition for Planning and Equitable 2035, and one of the main the main goal is trying to advocate for Stanford to build 5,000 affordable housing units for its faculty, workers, staff. And this will prevent those people fall into housing crisis or having to commute from Livermore every day. So I think, are there any if you're interested and if you're a community member, this very building, UVGR, is built because there are students demanding Stanford building more housing units. Because these are very low rises 5 years ago, 6 years ago when I first attended Stanford. And then because of those community demanding building more houses, we're able to have those, I don't know, almost looks East European style giant buildings, but they're beneficial. Are there any pushes for tech companies or to take responsibility?
It's so important because one of the biggest challenges with the Bay Area is that the housing crisis is a regional crisis, because say you work for Google, which is headquartered in Mountain View, or I don't know, Cupertino, or whatever. But like people that live in Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, they live there, but they travel down. So Google is only responsible for paying taxes in Mountain View, and yet the fallout of this housing crisis affects so many other counties and cities. It's really effing complicated because it's who has jurisdiction. So what we've been seeing in the Bay Area is that there's more and more of a regional approach to this. So the Bay Area, like regional council, like forgetting what the name of it is. It's like there's more regional collaboration. Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, which is like the ugliest acronym. What I want to show just here is that this is, I was going to originally present on this, but then decided not to because it's so much data. But it's like looking at kind of like who are the renters, what the area median income is of that region, and what rent do you need to be making in order to afford a one bedroom without being cost burden. And yet this is what the minimum wage is, which is nowhere near the wage that you need to afford a one bedroom. And this is what an annual teacher salary is when you're just starting to be a teacher, which is so much lower than what you need to afford a one bedroom. So I think that like for places like Stanford, where you have postdocs who basically, if it's anything like UC Berkeley, like postdocs and grad students run the university. Like we are the teaching staff and they just have faculty, just like as the brand name. But they basically but I think my friends who are grad students in Berkeley make like $36,000 a year, so they're considered like extremely rent burden or extremely low income. So I think there is like now more and more of a call for universities and like big employers to take more of the share and build housing. But they can't just create jobs and like what is their responsibility to the greater community. So it's awesome to hear that Stanford, that there is more of a push. I bet it's just like, even walking here though, like 2 blocks away on like Yale's Avenue, like it's like all single family homes, like, and it's like, you know, we're gonna have, so I think there's a lot of push, like for example, like Berkeley right now, it's like, I know that they're doing a lot of investigation on like the university owned land to see how they can transform that into high density housing, but there's so much opposition, both from the left of people who are getting displaced from that and versus people from the right, the homeowners who, this is going to create more traffic. This is like, but my vegetable garden, literally a woman showed up to a Berkeley City Council meeting with the zucchini and said, if you build this apartment, my zucchini won't get sun. It's like, but then there's more responsibility that large employers and organizations like universities can do, because they're technically nonprofits, they don't pay any taxes. But the tricky thing is around corporations. So there's a lot of like philanthropic things that like say Google did. Like I think it was Google that announced a $100 million commitment to building housing over 10 years, which like if you look at that number, you're like, oh my God, like that's so high. But it's over 10 years, so it's $10 million per year. And then it's like a drop in the effing bucket for them. And on top of that, like that doesn't go far enough. Like one thing that they could do is pay their contractors pay their janitorial staff, pay their like administrators more money so they can have a living wage. Like spread the wealth within the company. And like I know that Tech Equity is a really great organization doing this work and doing this advocacy, especially if you work in the tech sector. I have so many more thoughts about this. Come find me after, but I think we need to get out of this room. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful tour.